Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to all here at the C20 Summit. My name is Professor Wallace Ford, and I will be the moderator and panelist along with my colleague, Professor Tim Supremacy, and who's in Australia. I'm in New York City. And our panel, of course, is on racial justice and systemic discrimination, and all of the issues related to that. So let me begin by trying to indicate what we are going to try to do today, and want to thank all of you who are attending and will hopefully be participating in this very important discussion today. We'd like to talk a little bit about what the topic is that we're going to be talking about, and then I'm going to ask Professor Supremacy to both introduce himself and also to make some opening statements. I will do the same, and then we'll begin going through some of the key elements that we'd like to discuss. We'd like to indicate quite clearly that this is supposed to be an interactive discussion today. We are not doing dual lectures, but rather we're trying to initiate some conversation and dialogue. The fact that this is a global dialogue is really quite appropriate in these days and times, and we would like to try to keep that spirit going today. So with that, the topic itself, of course, is that this notion of racial justice and systemic discrimination is a matter clearly for global attention, because that racial injustice and racial discrimination have literally existed throughout history and throughout virtually all societies and countries throughout the world. The differences really have to do with this concept of the other, which we'll speak more about. But wherever we are in this world, there are instances of it, whether it's in today's, October 8th, 2020, or whether it's within the modern era or within the history of wherever we live. We do have this notion of injustice and discrimination based on some type of racial distinction. We've kind of come to this notion that race is a tertiary feature. It is black, it's white, or it's Asian, and of course it's much more complicated than that, and we'll talk more about that. We want to talk about some of the bases and causes of pervasive racial injustice and systemic racial discrimination, but we also want to talk about strategies and approaches to addressing what we believe, and the professor and I have discussed this, that one way of looking at this is, while we know that there is the COVID-19 pandemic, and there was the Spanish flu pandemic back in 1918, 1919. We're looking at a different type of global pandemic that has really existed since the human species that we could perhaps recognize today has been walking this earth. And so that is that's kind of the basis for our initial conversation. And as I said, at this point, I'm going to formally introduce my colleague and new friend, and never had a friend in Sydney, Australia before. So here we go. We're glad to do that. Professor Tim Supremacy, who's a professor of practice and sociology and political theory, and the director of culture strategy at the University of Sydney in Australia. Welcome.
Thank you, Wallace. Good to see you again.
Okay. All right. Well, so again, if you want to just make a few opening statements yourself,
sure,
and we'll kind of get right to it.
Well, it's a big topic, isn't it? Racial inequality and justice in the present day, and I think the questions that people have asked for years about race and equality have only become more urgent amid the COVID-19 pandemic. Across so many countries, we've seen racial inequality exposed in very stark ways. You see it in how minorities across many countries are being exposed to COVID-19 and its dangers in a disproportionate way. If you're looking at just about every country, racial minorities and migrants, Indigenous peoples are susceptible in many respects to either the physical harms of COVID-19, whether that's directly or whether that's through their concentration in particular industries which are deemed to be essential and cannot be guarded from exposure to the virus. And then on top of that, we have seen some groups being targeted for racial hostility as a result of COVID-19 too. Obviously, there have been well-documented attacks on Chinese people and those of Asian backgrounds, and that's been linked to COVID-19's provenance in Wuhan, China, and the fact that you've had political leaders in many countries highlighting that connection between China and the virus, even calling it the Chinese virus, as some have christened it, and that's only created more heightened experiences of racism for those from Chinese and other Asian backgrounds. You've seen it across Europe. You've seen it in the United States and North America. It's been here as well in Australia, where those from Asian backgrounds have felt the target of a lot of racial hostility and vilification. And through all this, I think we're starting to see a global reckoning around race. The protests that we saw beginning in the northern summer following the killing of George Floyd, protests which have been occurring across many American cities, but have also spread to cities in the United Kingdom, in Europe, here in Australia as well. There is a genuine global anti-racism moment that we are living through right now. Whether that will mean genuine, enduring solidarity on anti-racism that will lead to systemic change, it still remains too early to tell. I'm sure we've seen some statues, for example, topple in many countries as a result of this, but whether or not we're seeing a systemic shift in how countries are dealing with systemic racism and discrimination is still yet to be seen. But we are, I think, seeing the confluence of a number of things happening right now. We're seeing in many polities the normalization of racial hatred and white supremacism. We are seeing as well the rapid proliferation of disinformation campaigns and the emergence of post-truth politics, post-factual debate. And that's been amplified, of course, by social media and the pernicious effects of the dark side of the internet. And then on top of all that too, we're seeing increasing fragmentation in many of our societies where people are finding it hard to find common ground with others. And all of this makes for a very dangerous recipe if we're talking about racial inequality and racial injustice. We are in a very challenging time right now, and I think things can go either way. We can either see some definitive shifts towards more racial justice and equality, but we could also be seeing a worsening of race relations in more respects than one.
Okay. Great, and thank you for those initial comments. I'm pleased to that we are joined by the third member of our panel, Mr. William Spriggs, and who is the chief economist for the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations, also known as the AFL-CIO, an historic institution in the United States and really in the world. Mr. Spriggs, we are just beginning the session, of course, and what we would ask is that I'm sure you have some opening comments that you might wish to share on this whole issue. It's a very broad issue, of course, of racial justice and systemic discrimination, and we just want to get your perspective on what that issue means in your point of view. And then we're going to start getting, try to go through what those elements are. And as importantly, start talking about what some strategies, new strategies there may be for trying to address those. And I might mention, Mr. Spriggs, before you begin, that I had the pleasure and opportunity of seeing you, I guess, just about a week or so ago at the United Nations event involving historically black colleges and universities and the UNDP, and certainly enjoyed your presentation at that time. As they say, but we digress, but I did want to get that point in, and good day to you, sir. So if you would just please provide some opening remarks, and we're getting started here.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the invitation to be part of this. It's a different seat for me since I'm used to doing things with the L20. This is an extremely important topic. I think Tim set the table very well in terms of explaining the global reach of this phenomena, and I think it's always important to do that. It's easy to get wrapped up in the United States and to ignore the global nature of this, because the roots are in sort of the first globalization. When you think of the massive and unprecedented history of the Western Hemisphere, we depopulated an entire hemisphere by attacking the native people, and then we ripped people out of a different continent and repopulated a hemisphere with people that were forced to migrate to a different hemisphere. It infects the entire Western Hemisphere, but more than that, the African slave trade as conducted by the Arab Peninsula spread this same sense of inferiority on the part of people of African descent throughout the Indian Ocean as well. And then the roots intensify when you understand the colonial powers and their need to deal with their hypocrisy as they wanted to talk about their own democracy and superiority. And I think Tim used the correct term. It's this sense of white supremacy, which is really the issue and is common to so much of this. The movement from the United States, I think, spread precisely because this is a global phenomenon. It's not just that people who are upset at the United States or upset at an incident in the United States. It's because they were feeling the same about incidents in their own country, and it empowered them. It called to light this horrible power of white supremacy. And again, I think it's important to think of it as a systemic thing. There is a tendency, particularly among Europeans, to think of this as an individual thing. That is, there are individuals who discriminate. There are individuals who are racist. And then to ignore the way in which colonial powers embedded that the home country would have citizens who would come out on top. And even the French, who love to talk about solidarity, can't fully come to grips with their history, their colonial history, and the sense that people who come from the provinces, the external provinces, they can't quite come to grips with treating them as French. So it runs far deeper. This means something more than just individual acts. It is the replication of those systems that made the colonial powers thrive. And in the case of the Western Hemisphere, it is the things that entrenched the oligarchy of the slave owners. And so when you understand it as a system to ensure that one group will come out on top, then you understand it better than if you think of this as acts of single individuals. And that's why tearing down statues that memorialize those who promulgated this philosophy is so important, because it is a way for us to have an honest discussion and to understand what those symbols are meant to reinforce. So for people who don't know American history and cannot truly appreciate the American Civil War, Robert E. Lee was trained by the United States military. He went to our elite West Point where we train our officers. In the United States, your citizenship is really based on your belief in the American Constitution. In the United States, in order to be a citizen, you are pledging allegiance to that Constitution. When you take office in a constitutional office in the United States, a member of Congress, senator, president, if you are a top-ranking government official who has to swear on oath, if you are one of our military officers, you swear that you will defend, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, not the president, not the flag. It's that you will protect and defend the Constitution. He took that oath. Prior to the Civil War, there was a raid that was conducted not too far from my home in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, by a man named John Brown, who was convinced that slavery was an abomination. His raid was on an arsenal that he was going to use to start a slave rebellion. It did not succeed. He was captured by a Lieutenant Robert E. Lee. He was brought to trial for this attempt at stealing this arsenal, and he was hung. Lieutenant Robert E. Lee became General Robert E. Lee of the Confederacy. He took his oath and tore it up. Rather than defend the Constitution of the United States, he attacked the United States. As a result, if you tell me, or if I ask you, tell me the 5 worst days in the history of the United States Army, you're going to say, oh, D-Day, oh, Iwo Jima, oh, you're going to think of some battle in Vietnam. You'd be wrong, you'd be wrong, and you'd be wrong. It's still Gettysburg, Antietam, Fredericksburg. The United States lost, the United States Army, not the United States, the United States Army lost more men in the Civil War than the American Revolution, the War of 1812, our Second War against the British, the Mexican-American War when we stole half of Mexico, the Spanish-American War when we stole the Philippines, World War I, Korea, combined, plus Vietnam, combined. So understand that this man created more havoc than all the wars ever fought by the United States, save for World War II, combined. And yet there was a statue to him. There is no other country in the world in which you would build a statue to say, we honor this person who was a traitor, who broke their vows, who broke their oath, and then created the worst conflict by far in the history of the nation. And I'm not adjusting for the size of the United States in the 1860s when I'm saying how many men were lost. This is in absolute terms.
Okay, Mr. Spriggs, let me just, if I want to interject for a moment, because we want to move into our further discussion, but you raised an interesting point with respect to this notion of white supremacy. And one of the things that we touched on just briefly, and like your comment, and also Professor Sudmasan, with respect to this point, which is there's no doubt that the issue of white supremacy is one that needs a lot more examination and discussion. And I think you've, Mr. Spriggs, you've already begun that process here for us today. But we also talked about this notion that racial discrimination really, or this notion of systemic racism knows no color, in the sense that if you can identify someone else as the other, and there's a comment I made just before you began, which is that we've kind of looked at race on a global sense in some tertiary notion that it's black, it's white, and it's Asian, and whatever that may mean to people. However, in point of fact, it may be more. No, it's a point of fact. There is a point of view that it may be more complicated than that. And I like your comment, on this, both from you, Mr. Spriggs, and Professor Sudmasan, on this, because just to your point about the slave trade, for example, there is no extensive industrial-sized slave trade without the participation of Africans. The Europeans did not march up into from the coast up 1,000 miles from the coastline to snatch people and bring them to the coast. They were brought to the coast, and they were brought to the coast by fellow people who were Africans, but obviously looked at some people as being the other, because I'm from this tribe, you're from that tribe. I'm from this village, you're from that village. And that distinction would be enough for me to treat you as the other. And what we've been talking about, or would like to talk about, is to the extent that I can identify someone else as the other, okay, I can then justify doing just about anything to them. And all of the horrific activities that we see associated with white supremacy have been replicated by various peoples against various peoples. Whether we talk about the Hutus against the Tutsis, we talk about what happened at the partition of India and Pakistan back in the 1940s, and the list unfortunately just goes on and on and on. Professor Sudmasan, I'd like to ask you to just the jump ball between you and Mr. Spriggs, and see what you gentlemen think about that. This notion of the other as a principal driving force in this notion of systemic racism, as opposed to some binary or tertiary construct.
What a question. I'll have a crack at this, Wallace. If I understand correctly, I mean, one of the questions you're raising here is whether the phenomenon of racism should be understood predominantly or exclusively as emanating from notions of white supremacy, and I think my response to that would be that white supremacy emerges as a prototypical form of racism. If we understand racism to involve a combination of prejudice and power, if we understand racism to be implicated in history and in how historically groups of people have understood some groups to be superior to others, and have understood certain others to be occupants of particular rungs within the hierarchy of nations or peoples, then white supremacy does loom large, and it looms large going back to the emergence of Enlightenment thought in Europe, and in notions of civilization. I think this is something that William touched on, talking about the slave trade historically. This isn't to say, of course, that racism doesn't assume all manner of forms and exists in many countries. It needn't be reduced to white supremacy, but perhaps one reason why we focus on white supremacy is that it does represent a prototype of what racial hatred can involve. It's highly sophisticated. It's developed a history over hundreds of years. It has evolved over time, and it has come back with a vengeance in recent years. I think we may all have thought that we were on a path towards progress on race, and that we wouldn't be entertaining a mass resurgence in white nationalism and white supremacy. But yet here we are in 2020, and it's happened very rapidly, very fast. And if you look at the debates that have been occurring in many countries, and tracking the development of contemporary ideas around racism, I think what you find is things that do accord with historic notions of white supremacy, except it's no longer being referred to as white supremacy. It's being couched in more respectable language now. So you have these identitarian movements in Europe, for example, You have this idea of the great replacement really starting to shape far-right and neo-Nazi discourses. The idea here, around having a form of cultural self-determination for white people, which is really just another expression of old-fashioned white supremacist racism. But if you're looking at the contemporary expressions of this, particularly in the West, then you're finding a regurgitation of white supremacist ideas, or perhaps better described as a mutation of those ideas. But if we look outside white supremacy and try to understand the basic essence or the commonality across different expressions of racism, I think that notion of the other that you've mentioned, Wallace, is critical here. Racism and discrimination are really about dehumanizing another group or subjugating another group. And it's often cognate to political phenomena and social sentiments which are bound up in feelings of fear and anger. I think these are the ingredients for racism. You don't need to just have a notion of one group being supreme, but it's more often than not bound up in a feeling that people have that they're under threat, that there's some kind of challenge to an existing hierarchy or way of life. And when you have fear and then anger, whether it's misplaced anger directed at elites who may be favoring one group over another, or anger that may be generated by economic exclusion or marginalization, those feelings can come together and form hatred very quickly. And I think that's where I see the commonalities. And if you look beyond the Western liberal democracies experience and look at what's happening in parts of Asia, whether it's for example in Myanmar, or whether it's in India or in other parts of the world, I think these are the common elements that I'd be drawing out, and I think they're the elements that political actors are exploiting with increasing impunity right now across the world.
Mr. Spriggs, your thoughts on that, please.
Yeah, I would concur. I took part in the 2001 World Conference Against Racism, which was labeled Racism, Xenophobia, and Related Forms of Intolerance. And the related forms of intolerance are important to understand the phenomena, because it does extend beyond race. It extends to matters of religion, as we see in India and Myanmar. It extends to ethnic group, as we see within China. So there are elements that you can see repeated of othering, as you mentioned, the sense that there are a group of people that I can't harm because they're incapable of being harmed. That's what makes the murder by police that we saw in George Floyd's case so disturbing, because this was a tape that was unusual. And most of the tapes, you don't see the police officers in the same way. They are doing something. Someone ends up dying. But in this one, the police officer is looking you straight in the eye. He's looking at the filmmaker straight in the eye. He knows he's on camera, and he's confronting you in the camera. So when you're watching it, it's a different perspective. You see this person is actually a killer. They're not just doing something. They're actively killing someone, and they're staring back at you and knowing that, and telling you you are powerless to do anything about me killing this person. That's why people were so struck by the movie, because the film clip, because it was actually obscene. It was pornography. And so, yes, we can see this repeated I think it's the level of dimension. I think it's the way in which those elements of othering create a system that is sustainable, a system that can reinforce itself. And I think that's what distinguishes what we're discussing, as apart from some normal frictions, which, as you mentioned, these are ancient, common, and many times don't have anything to do with people even necessarily looking different. Sometimes not even necessarily different religions. So that's what I think makes this, what we're discussing, different. And that's why I talk about it within the context of colonialism, because it is the sense that one group has the right to exploit the other group economically, not just physically. And then we clean up our colonial history so that it doesn't seem so violent. And we kind of gloss over the violence inherent in that colonialism. It ends up being more about white supremacy because of that, in my view, because other ancient empires, there were many ancient empires on the Asian continent, did not necessarily evolve into the kind of colonialism where one group felt they had the right to extract wealth and economic gain from another group, and a sense of a hierarchy in which one group would always be dominant. And it evolves to different extremes. Yes, there was African slave trade everywhere. In the United States, it was bizarre in the sense that, one, the slave's status was derived from their mother, not from their father. By British common law, your status came from your father, because if the king went out to sow his wild oats, then that illegitimate child could be given royal lineage. And so it always went through the father. The fact that it went through the mother was to create this different system in which a father would enslave his own child. And it was a different system in that many other cultures had adopted that if you are converted to the religion of the dominant group, we can't enslave you because our religion prevents that. So a lot of the Arab slave trade wasn't possible to enslave another Muslim, because that would be violating a principle, a deep principle about the religion. The United States, you can enslave a Christian. So you had a weird system in which I can enslave my child who's a Christian. So you had Thomas Jefferson trading his own children who were Christians, which is the bizarre nature. And so it's this dimension that I'm speaking of that I think is different than the level of othering that is almost human nature. We are social beings and we are tribal, but this is a different level. It's a level that is meant to secure and sustain economic hierarchy, which I think is a little different.
Well, okay, I'm glad you mentioned that word tribal, because of course when we look at the origins really of the human species, and as our great ancestors began to just organize themselves into some societal structure, the first was family, of course, because that was a need for survival. It was just a very, very clear thing. And the next really came, something that we now would call as tribes and clans are the next iterations of that. So yes, there's always been that kind of distinction. But I guess the point that we were talking about, that we are talking about now, and because this is a global summit and we have people participating from all over the world, is that I think it's important to point out that indeed, wherever you are in the world, if you just take a little closer look at where how life goes, there are the quote normal frictions that come about from some sense of it could be family or religion or what have you, and then there's something deeper, and I would submit seriously more problematic. When you look at, for example, how the Japanese treated Koreans, for example, for years, for centuries. I lived in Japan as a child, and I have some very real memory of the fact that Koreans and this is in the 1950s were treated very much in the same way that Black people were treated in America in terms of discrimination, segregation, and denial of basic rights. So I think to the extent that one of the points that we wanted to talk about, that it is a global problem and an historic one. The last point I'd make is that we wanted to talk about just how we address this notion of systemic racism wherever it goes. Jared Diamond, who is an American sociologist, had written this book called "Guns, Germs, and Steel." Okay, and he talks about the fact that basically the rise, if you will, of Euro-American dominance in the world is a relatively short phenomenon in the span of, let's say, easily 6,000 years of human history as we might understand it. But it is because we are living in that time that we are so focused on that, of course. And his point is that there's nothing really superior about any particular ethnic group or racial group, but that there's a coincidence of certain herd immunity that Europeans had after the bubonic plague, that there was just a rise in the use of certain technologies, including steel and including certain types of warfare that gave them a real advantage in other parts of the world. And but that is there's no reason to believe that is an infinite kind of position for the Euro-American dominance, and in many ways we see that changing right before our very eyes. But let me I'm keeping a track and with our colleagues in the booth, I guess is what it is, about if there are any questions or comments, and I'd certainly invite anybody who's listening and watching right now, if you have questions or comments, to please convey them, because we would like to hear from you and engage with you as well. Let me put this out to you, Mr. Spriggs, and also Mr. Sutphon Masan, that if we looked at systemic racism in the modern era where we're living right now, and just putting this out as a concept, as a public health problem, that is, it's something that affects and afflicts many people in various in places in the world, in various levels of society, and so on. If we looked at it as a public health problem, and it's a pandemic, okay, and we're all very familiar with the concept of pandemic these days. Typically there's a four-part approach to it, right? That you have to identify the problem, you have to isolate the problem, you got to treat it, and you have to have some type of public health strategy, a public strategy, if you will. Can we use that? Can we try and find an analog for addressing systemic racism in a similar, perhaps not an exact, but in a similar fashion? And this jump ball gentleman, I don't know, Mr. Spriggs, if you want to take a swing at that, and Mr. Sutphon Masan, please have at it.
Thank you. Well, I mean, I thought your raising of the issue of the Japanese and Korea was very apt, because the Japanese practice modern colonialism. They are one Asian nation that did colonialism in the same way as Europeans, and so I think it was an apt analogy to raise their relationship to Korea to other Asian nations, many of whom felt during World War II that, yes, we got rid of the European colonialists, but the Japanese are just Asian colonialists. And we can see that in the relationship between China and some of its neighbors who feel that China's colonizing them, and they feel treated differently because of that. It's the mentality of the colonizer. I don't know that I feel comfortable with characterizing systemic racism as a disease, because I think it tends to treat it like it's an individual thing, so I can inoculate you. I think it conjures up that same sense that it's an individual thing you catch, and it's different. It's like opposing a system that's evil. So I don't think, for instance, I would think of the Nazis as a disease. It's a system that you're opposing. I think there are some ways to undo the system, which look like you're inoculating people. In the 1950s, when the United States was fully aware of the kind of manipulation that the current Russian government takes advantage of, Americans were taught by the government, by our media, don't hate. We had commercials during the most popular radio shows to remind Americans, we are one nation, we look different, and you should accept everyone as American. We had the government actually preaching this. So you can set a tone, you can fight against the mechanisms by which this becomes a self-replicating machine. But I think it's not helpful, because I don't think it's helpful to think of it only in those terms, because then you ignore that the reason it's sustainable is a reality that people actually gain from it. So the problem within the AFL-CIO was, for the longest, unions in the United States were tools of exclusion. They were a means of protecting jobs for white men. They wrote constitutions to only allow white men as members, even when they would admit that union members can be of any race. They would have segregated units, totally against the labor movement. So that dimension of power is not something that gets erased, because people remember when we were the only ones who had this job, and they think of this as an economic challenge when you go against it. So I think what would be missing if you tried to do it only as a disease, that the tools would be inadequate, that you would have to understand the transformation to a different way of thinking, to a system that was actually more based on merit. Because the problem is, one of the ways in which the system replicates itself is our sense of merit is not independent. We're having a fight now in the United States over our SAT scores, because suddenly in the United States, it doesn't give the order that people had wanted. It doesn't maintain the racial hierarchy. And there's wide discussion of wanting to abandon it. That's our entrance exam to get into our elite colleges. And so that's why I say it's more complex, because the system creates its own justifications, and you have to fight against even those justifications. You have to wake people up that what they think is a merit-based system may not be merit-based, and that's, I think, different than treating a disease.
Okay, Professor Sumasan.
Yeah,
Your thoughts?
really interesting question, Wallace. I mean, I think I can understand the temptation to draw an analogy between racism and a public health challenge. I mean, there are some elements of racism that do resemble a public health issue, in the sense that I think racism can be contagious. For example, seeing an outbreak of prejudice and hatred can quickly spread. So there's an analogy there that I think is interesting. I also think it's interesting to consider that just as a disease can be prevented, I think racism can be prevented too. It may not exist as a biological disease; it doesn't reside in the form of a pathogen, but I do think that you can prevent racial hatred. Interventions can work, and just as in public health scenarios, inaction or indifference from governments and leaders can lead to a worsening of public health outcomes. So it is with race. If you have a political society that is indifferent or that doesn't take action in combating prejudice and discrimination, then the problem gets worse. And then there's a very basic similarity too that I can identify in the form of the harm of racism. Racism can kill, just as a disease can kill. So racism isn't just something, and this is something that William has made very powerfully here. We're talking about systems and ways of conducting politics and economics that can hurt, subjugate, and indeed kill people. So in those respects, I can see the appeal in thinking of it as a public health analog, but I also have reservations in the form that William has articulated, which is that we're ultimately talking about a political problem when we're talking about racism. And we're not just talking about changing behaviors, which is the paradigm of a public health intervention. You intervene in order to change the behavior of a society or a community so as to stop the spread of a disease or to prevent a social ill from growing. In the case of racism, you're talking about systems. So you can't just fix behaviors, you've also got to fix systems, which then makes it an inherently political proposition. And that's where I think the analogy may start to break down a little. And if you kind of go through the steps that were highlighted, Wallace, in your question, identifying a problem, isolating it, treating it, having a strategy over it. In most public health on most public health issues, there would be pretty clear consensus on what all those things would mean. But if you look at debates about race in just about every country, I think you'll find that identifying the cause of racism is often deeply contested by parts of society. When you're talking about isolating the cause, sometimes the isolation of the cause of racism may not be enough to solve racism, right? It can actually create a backlash or the conditions for a worsening of racism too. So I think we're dealing with a complex and difficult beast here, and it's complex and difficult because it is political and it is historical. But I think, in the present moment that we live in, where we're all thinking about the pandemic and where we have heightened consciousness of public health, I think there are some things that may be helpful in raising understanding and consciousness of racism. And I think one of those elements is that element of contagion, which is that if you start venting or airing racist ideas, those ideas start spreading, and they spread quickly. And I think we've seen this in recent years where, in 2016, listening to the ideas of white nationalists in mainstream debate in the United States or Europe could have been regarded as an aberration. But now look at the debates that we've got right now, and I think we've seen how quickly those ideas are spreading. So I think there is something in that public health analog, Wallace, that I think is insightful and interesting. But at the same time, I think we've got to remember we're dealing with a political issue here at bottom, and unfortunately, it won't be as straightforward as a public health intervention if we're talking about solving or eradicating racism.
Okay, we're going to pivot for a moment because we want to come back to this issue because spoiler alert to our audience and with our panel, we are charged with trying to, I don't think anybody expects us to come up with solutions, but at least to consider some strategies for addressing this. But a question came from one of the people who are in the audience having to do with the COVID-19 pandemic, which of course is a global concern, and the extent to which that this particular health pandemic, no argument on that at all, has revealed those certain racially certain systemic racism issues. And I would just again ask either of you, what your thoughts are in terms of let us accept for the sake of this discussion that it has that's a truth of sorts. When I say of sorts, it depends on your perspective, and I'm asking both of you, if indeed the pandemic has revealed certain aspects of systemic racism, what are they, or what's your thoughts on that? Jump ball, gentlemen.
I went first last time.
Okay.
Professor Supasan.
Thanks, William. So I think we can talk about this in both in respect to direct manifestations and indirect manifestations, if you will. We've seen some very clear examples around the world where the emergence of COVID-19 has seen some groups being directly targeted for racism. So those from Chinese and Asian backgrounds, for example, have been fingered in many countries for spreading the disease because of the disease's origin in China. If you look at the experience in Europe, for example, I think there was a very notable social media campaign that emerged where you had people declaring that they were not the virus, or I am not the virus. And that was instigated by people from Asian backgrounds. I think I mentioned the experience in Australia where those from Asian backgrounds have been subjected to greater targeting by some elements of society for racial discrimination. Where for example people are being verbally assaulted, even physically assaulted in a number of incidents that we've seen in Sydney and Melbourne. And I think this has been reported too in some parts of the United States where Asian Americans have been subjected to some attacks. And then there's the indirect heightening of racism, which perhaps is more to the point around the exposure or revelation of underlying racial inequality. I think if you look at the way that the pandemic has spread in many countries and look at who's most susceptible to catching the virus, they tend to be those who work in industries where exposure to the virus is considerably greater, where, for example, the relative luxury of working from home may not necessarily be possible. So if you look at who occupies those sorts of occupational hazards, you will find that in many cases it's those who belong to racial minorities. And I think statistically this is borne out as an example of how those from minority groups, those who are migrants, those who are in more marginal positions in society are finding themselves more exposed to this. So that perhaps would be the manner in which I'm seeing systemic racism being revealed through the COVID-19 experience. And I think those two dimensions kind of highlight the two faces of racism, right? Racism can be very overt, where certain groups get targeted or get singled out, but it can also be much more subtle and and covert even. And that's the case where you look at, who's there working in healthcare or in sanitation, in occupational positions where they can't avoid the risk of COVID, and then compare it to those who work in, office jobs who have the luxury of working from home. And I think if you look at it that way, it becomes very clear that there are racial divides in many countries right now.
Okay.
I would say one of the stark differences in the U.S. in 2009, when we had the H1N1 flu, having been in the government at the time, we were strictly instructed to not call this the swine flu, because our pork producers were so concerned that if we called it the swine flu, that people would stop eating pork, that they would think that eating pork was dangerous. And so everyone was given these sheets. It's the H1N1 virus. Look at this current administration that calls it the Chinese virus. So I totally get what Tim was saying. This is the difference in how stark racism can take, that we wouldn't want to offend hog farmers, but we would put at risk the lives of people by identifying the disease with them. So that just stands out. And in the United States, it has taken a very dangerous turn, because in the United States, when it became apparent that there was a disparate outcome in terms of deaths, this suddenly changed the conversation. I don't think it was coincidence that Trump's view of fighting the disease changed when people had it revealed to them, this disparate outcome of death. And then it changed in a dangerous way for all Americans, because the initial explanation was, well, Blacks have poor health and they have poor access to healthcare. And it suddenly appeared in the news as if, well, white people are immune from this disease in some way, and so therefore are safe, that they aren't in a category of people who are at danger. Now, this wasn't true. Black people were dying because of the jobs that Black people had. Black people were more likely to catch the disease. If you look at people who have the disease, Black people are not more likely to die. We are not. The CDC did a study of this and found that these other explanations that had been used, that we were more likely to have diabetes, more likely to have asthma or other
obesity,
well, all of those comorbidity factors, it turned out when the CDC looked at patients, that wasn't true. Blacks were not patients with significantly higher levels of comorbidity. On the health issue, the UK has a national healthcare system. Every Black, Asian, and ethnic minority person in the UK has had access to it from their birth. And they exhibit the same catch it more, and therefore, because they catch it more, they die more. So it's not our access to healthcare. It isn't our health. It's that we have the jobs that exposed us more. And so unfortunately, the message that gets taught to Americans actually, I think, actually contributes to some of what we're seeing, which is a poor response. People somehow or another convince themselves that white people were not as susceptible to this disease, that there was this difference. And so in this case, I think what got revealed was that people were willing to accept underlying racist notions about the inferiority of people in a way that was dangerous and continues to be dangerous. And it's one of the factors that I think leads to this bad behavior on a number of people who don't want to take the proper safety precautions about the disease.
Well, thank you. Okay, gentlemen, in the time we have left, and this has been an interesting discussion so far. I would again say to those people who are watching and this particular session, this is not a tri-part lecture, of course, and to the extent that you have any questions or comments, we invite you to post that in the chat room and we'll look to respond. While we're doing that, however, I'd like to ask, the theme of this entire summit, of course, has to do with the role of individuals and, of course, various organizations and ultimately states in what is the role of the state in addressing a range of issues that are being discussed here at the C20 summit. And of course, our issue has to do with this question of racial justice and systemic discrimination. And we've tried to address that in various ways. But I'd like to ask you both to comment on this, give your thoughts with respect to the role of the state in addressing this condition. Okay, and however you wish to describe it, there is typically a role, and I'll give you some examples. And for starters here, gentlemen, when we talk about addressing societal conditions that at one point were considered to be intractable. Okay, and we look at things like just a couple of items that we have. Child labor. Child labor existed for literally thousands of years. Was considered to be a legitimate part of society for thousands of years, and of course, in large parts of the world, we no longer see child labor as being. It still exists. Certainly, we know that, but nowhere near the extent to which it did for literally thousands of years. Public health. Public health is again something that again we kind of take for granted, but the notion of general public health strategies adopted by the state, however you define the state, whether it's a monarchy or democracy, doesn't matter. We're talking about the role of government, if you will, in dealing with public health and seeing that as a direct role. Again, is a relatively, in the history of humanity, a relatively new phenomenon. The notion of rights of women. Okay, at the time that the Declaration of Independence was being signed in 1776 in what is now the United States, women literally could not own property. Okay, and that went into the 19th century for sure, and even aspects of that still we saw in the 20th century. And yet today, and while again there's no doubt that there's still major progress that needs to be done with respect to the issue of women's rights, the role of the state in at least acknowledging that women's rights is a legitimate issue is something that again it created a change after millennia of women basically having no rights in many and most societies through history. And so I'm not suggesting for a moment that okay, the state is just the answer, but can this? I guess a better way of posing the question is: can the state play a role with respect to the areas of acknowledgement of the issue, as ultimately took place with respect to child labor, education, which took education of the people with respect to that issue, whether it's public health, as I said, or women's rights, creative reactions. Okay, again, on the issue of child labor, for example, universal and free and compulsory K-12 education, literally legislation to address some of these. And again, the last point, and both of you gentlemen, touched on it, the role of social media in all of this. Okay, because the state, like it or not, also is tremendously affected. The state, the governmental apparatus in which we may live, any place in the world where our guests and attendees may be, are dealing with this issue of social media. While it may not be state run, it is certainly it does affect the state. So that's the jump ball, gentlemen. I think that we've kind of had a sequence now. I guess Professor Sutramasan, when we start with you and Mr. Spriggs, I'm guessing you may have a few things to say about it. Just a wild guess on my part.
I think it might have been William's turn to go first. So I'm happy to cede to you, William, unless you prefer for me to go first.
I'll go first, so you can have the last word. I have thoroughly enjoyed your point of view. It's been very enlightening, and I think it's very helpful to have people from different countries so that we can balance this view. On the public health side argument again, a plus for thinking of it from that perspective is if someone is racist, then they're not rational. They are making a judgment that isn't rational. And so once they signal to you they aren't rational, then they're not rational. And therefore they're easy to manipulate. So there's little question why, if you look in the United States as an example, the same people who tend to be the most racist are the ones who don't believe this virus is real. They don't believe in climate change. There are a host of things that they don't believe because they've already exhibited to you. I'm not rational. I cannot interpret information on a rational basis. You cannot present to me an argument based on facts that will then influence my behavior. And so having a lot of irrational people, of course, is dangerous. And I think the point raised earlier that Tim raised is important because it does seem to spread. It does seem to reinforce itself. And there is this contagion. The government can play a role by itself actively investigating what is it doing that is based on these belief systems, and what is the government doing that contributes to enforcing and reinforcing these beliefs. So this can happen. I think as an institution, the United States military had to confront this in 1948 when President Truman forced their integration. They tried to enforce rational thinking because they understood that literally you would kill people themselves if you didn't make rational decisions. And they came to believe this. And of American institutions, they tend to be among the better integrated. They haven't solved the problem, but better integrated entities. And they have tried their best to figure out, can we scrub ourselves of ways in which we replicate racial hierarchies the best that they knew or know how to do. Governments can do that. And governments can remove the legitimacy. The leadership of the government can remind people of values that are being undermined because of these people. So when President Trump said, I see good people on both sides, when he was looking at neo-Nazis and people who are opposing the neo-Nazis, this is not helpful. Governments can ask their other major institutions. The labor movement in the United States is constantly scrubbing itself now. It is very aware of its racist past and very aware of a need to figure out how can we scrub ourselves of this, because in the world in which we now live, a far more diverse labor force, the idea that you're going to just speak on behalf of a small minority of your labor force isn't going to get wages up, isn't going to defend the rights of workers. So you have to defend the rights of all workers. So it's government getting other partners to understand that racism is not rational. And the challenge because we do live in a global world that is different, and people are now moving freely and not because they're in chains, is for government to take the role of re-educating people on citizenship. The United States actively taught that citizenship meant you just came to these shores. We actively taught the acceptance of immigrants. This was not in America's DNA. There have been many anti-immigrant movements in the United States, and at different points dominated the political discourse. But we actively supported research and the works of historians who could amplify the message. And the United States now in the world has this image that America embraces immigration. And people think that Americans who are anti-immigrant somehow or another are anti-American. This is what people think of the United States. Whether it's true or not, it is part of the myth we now have accepted. Many people don't even understand that the whole thing about being born in the United States makes you a citizen has nothing to do with immigrants. It had everything to do with slavery. It's rooted in fighting back against what the government knew our southern states would try to do. They would try to redefine citizenship. And knowing that, we put that clause into our Constitution. This is the same sort of thought that governments can do. They can understand what racist elements within their country would do and take aggressive steps to fight against it. And this also means being more careful about what citizenship means so that people have a different sense of what rights are. And so many countries, when you look at their citizenship standard, it embeds racist notions and makes it difficult for a diverse society to develop with equal rights. And again, part of that gets back to how do we tell our story? One of the things that many of us are finding out, again, looking back at history, is the sense of citizenship in Rome, one of the earliest transcontinental empires. And they had to adapt to what is a Roman citizen. And we have come to find out that there were people of African descent who were Roman soldiers, who were Roman citizens. We don't teach that for a reason, because that would undermine our current racist notions. And so governments can do this by scrubbing their own racism, teaching the new way, and interrupting those institutions that reinforce the racism. So I think there's a lot that government can do. And social media has a huge role to play. The image of African Americans is blasted across the world because of the popularity of our Hollywood movies. The sense that many people have of African Americans comes from the racism and the racist messages within our movies. So it's not just Google and Facebook and Twitter, it's deeper. And there's a lot that the government can do to support diversity and voices so that we can communicate in ways that aren't racist.
Okay. Hi, Professor Sufamasan.
Yeah, fascinating to listen to William there. And I concur with William that this implicates a question of citizenship. And if you think that combating racism implicates a duty of citizenship or protecting the idea of citizenship, the idea that every member of our society or of your society should have equal standing and should enjoy dignity in their lives, then there has to be a role for the state and for government in dealing with racial inequality and injustice. This is a question that I've had to reflect on and think about, particularly given my previous role as Race Discrimination Commissioner at the Australian Human Rights Commission. And during the 5 years I was in that position, we had 2 concerted attempts by the federal government to repeal parts of our racial discrimination legislation. And it was my view and the view of the Commission that there should be no change to the laws that we had concerning race and racial hatred. Those who had been proposing a change had been arguing that free speech demanded that there be more unfettered debate in Australia. And we had a very live debate over the course of a number of years about what the proper role of the state should be. That there were those who wanted to see a change to our laws, who said that it shouldn't be the role of the state to heavily regulate speech or to place restrictions on what people could say, even if it caused racial offence and harm, because the best way to respond to bad forms of speech on race was through good forms of speech on race, that you should take every opportunity to counter hatred through more speech. And that to me goes to some of the central questions around the role of the state. If you have confidence that there can be a marketplace of ideas where racism can be combated, where civil society can be counted upon to regulate parts of our society's conduct, then you may think that there is no cause for the state or for government to step in. But if you take the view that markets can fail and that the marketplace of ideas doesn't always involve equally powerful combatants or voices, then I think you very quickly end up appreciating the important role that the government can play to ensure that those who are powerful don't drown out those who don't wield power in our society. Because it's easy for someone to say, well, if you're on the receiving end of racism, you can always exercise your freedom and speak back, or vote with your feet and not go to places that discriminate against you. Then you can miss a crucial part of racism, which is that power element. Some people may simply not have the voice or have the wherewithal or the power or the ability to exercise what can be a privilege. And so I think that the state has an important role here in a number of senses. One is through leadership. You can set the tone of society. You can really set the atmospherics and regulate what happens in society in that way. And I think you can never understate the impact of statements that leaders make on race. If, for example, you've got political leaders who target certain groups in society or suggest that elements in society are criminal or don't belong or are importing diseases or pose threats to national security, then you shouldn't be surprised to find that people start targeting certain groups on that basis. So that's one thing that I think is important. A second role for the state, I think, is to have legislative protections against discrimination, to make sure that if members of society do experience discrimination, they can hold that discrimination to account. Having laws against discrimination, I think, amounts to an expression of society's values, but more than that, they can provide a practical means for people to counter racism in its many forms. And then thirdly, there's the educative elements of state action, which I think go to the need to ensure that attitudes can change over time, that you have programs which seek to educate people about racism and change people's behaviour and practices. Now, one thing that strikes me about debates regarding the role of the state is you can very easily, or you can very quickly hear those who may be of a libertarian or anti-state bent who will say, well, in many countries, you've had laws against racial discrimination for decades and generations now, but that hasn't done anything to eradicate racism or racial discrimination. The implication being that legislation cannot solve social ills. And I think that's a very powerful rhetorical tool that we often see deployed here. But think of it this way too. I mean, in every society, in every civilized society we know of, I think you have laws which outlaw murder and outlaw theft. But laws against murder and theft have not eradicated murder and theft, have not prevented them from occurring. Yet I don't think many people would make the suggestion that that is a sign of their ineffectiveness and reason for them to be repealed. I'm drawing here on some of the more extreme elements of the debate that I've seen in Australia, if only to prove or to demonstrate what I think is a reductio ad absurdum that you can see in these debates around the role of the state. Yes, the state cannot eradicate racism because it goes to our human frailties, but that in itself is not a reason for the state not to legislate or for there not to be a role for the state in regulating people's conduct. So I absolutely believe that there's got to be a role for the state and for government and for political leaders to play in all of this. And unfortunately, we don't always see governments and states doing the right thing on race. Quite often, they're the ones who are fueling hatred and prejudice and discrimination. And when you've got that, it makes it exceedingly difficult to achieve progress on race.
Well, yeah, and I think both of you raised a very clear point with respect to the discussion of the role of the state. There are stated ideals, and then there's the actual implementation or enforcement, if you will, of those stated ideals. There shouldn't need to be, for example, the United States Constitution, there shouldn't needed to have an amendment that said Black men had the right to vote, which was passed and ratified in the 15th Amendment, or the amendment that says women should have the right to vote, because ostensibly the Constitution without those amendments should apply. You shouldn't need to have a specific language in the Constitution to say it, but it was necessary because obviously it was necessary because without that you didn't have the ground, the basis for at least some people felt for enforcement of these ideals that were put in place in the first instance. So, we're coming to a close. In introducing the two of you gentlemen, I neglected to mention the fact that I am, as I said, myself, of course, Professor Wallisford from Medgar Evers College with the City University of New York in New York City. And we're certainly pleased to be a part of this panel as well. And I want to thank you again, Mr. William Spriggs from the AFL-CIO, American Federation of Labor, and Congress of Industrial Organizations in the United States, based in Washington, D.C., I believe at Howard University, and one of our great historically Black colleges and universities in the United States, and Mr. Tim Sutphommasane. Please tell me I got it right at least that last time around.
You've done very well, Wallace. Thank you.
Thank you. The University of Sydney in Australia. And both of you gentlemen, your comments and perspectives are extremely valuable. I'm hoping that our attendees and participants from around the world have enjoyed and appreciated this exchange of ideas and perspectives on such a very serious item of concern. And we didn't think that we would solve it today, but we do hope that we've given some perspectives that can lead to different initiatives, and perhaps there'll be another, maybe it'll be the C20 summit or something like that, where at another point in time we'll be able to see that some real progress has been made around the world, because it is a global issue. And, to the extent that every solution begins with an acknowledgement that there's a need for discussion. And I think both of you gentlemen have certainly put forward the case that there is a need for discussion, a need for acknowledgement, because you can't have anything resembling a solution without acknowledgement that there's a need for a solution. And I think there is certainly, we all know as we can do better. and there are examples where we have done better over time. This is one more opportunity for us to show the best of ourselves, and to try to move away from the worst aspects of ourselves. And so with that, I think they say the clock on the wall is saying that we're going to, I think our tech people have told us that we're going to disappear from the screen in just a few minutes. So I want to thank those who are in attendance. I understand that, including attendees at the summit, people are on Facebook and Twitter and Vimeo and all kinds of stuff. So I want to thank all of you for your participation, and thank you for your acknowledgement. And we will look forward to following up and staying in touch and all those good things. And want to again finally thank the organizers of the C20 Summit for inviting all of us to participate in what is clearly an historic event, and look forward to doing so in the future. So with that, thank you very much, gentlemen. And next panel, we'll be able to say ladies and gentlemen for sure. But we'll move forward from there. So thank you again. And I think, as that cartoon once said, that's all, folks. So, there we go. So thank you.